Hello and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's final event for the academic year. We are here with Professor Angelika Kratzer, who is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here.
We have that's absolutely our pleasure. We have a lot of questions about lots of things about semantics and the and bits about syntax. So to start very broadly, how would you characterize semantics? What do you think it is the study of?
Yeah, so it's of course a very good question. It's also a very difficult question. It's a very broad question. And sometimes it's really you delimit a field just by doing it. So you gradually discover what belongs to the field and what doesn't belong. And so what I am mainly concerned with is the truth conditional content of meaning. And so that is very simple. We have like a sentence like, the grass is green. So one way of thinking, what does it mean for a person to understand the meaning of that sentence? What kind of qualification does that person have to have? And so one idea that people had, and so that is still an idea that we are trying to implement in one way or other, is that you understand the meaning of a sentence. And in that case, we are talking about declarative sentences mainly. You understand it if you can associate it with the right type of possible situations. So one thought experiment that has been tried here is you could give the person a slideshow and could ask the person, well, is that sentence true? Or another famous sentence is, the cat is on the mat. So maybe there we have more possibilities for a slideshow, and you would show the person slides of possible situations, possible ways the world could be. Mm-hmm. And if the person says, yes, if there's a cat on a mat in whatever way, then cat may be placed in various corners of the mat. It may be different types of cats. It may be different types of mats. There may be different surroundings of that situation. And a person who just picks out the right type of situation, we could say that that is a sense that person has understood the meaning of a sentence. And so then you can say, okay, these are just declarative sentences, but we have other sentences too. We have questions, we have commands, we have just exclamations. We say things like oops and hooray, and all those expressions have meaning too. And so we just inch our way from this beginning where we have a truth conditional semantics, we inch our ways further into the meanings of those other constructions. And this is how the field then has developed. And so now we sort of think about various levels of meanings, and you could think of it like a musical score. So you have various voices. And so in the construction of meaning, it's very similar. So you have a truth conditional content, then you have sometimes more emotional contents, but that are still conventionalized, so they're part of our knowledge of meaning. And so that's sort of gradually, we just inch our way into that subject matter.
So how important is cross-linguistic data for the enterprise?
Yeah, it's very, very important. And it's also something that's very dear to my heart. We just, Irene and I, we were editing, or we are still editing this journal, Natural Language Semantics, and we have just handed it over now to Amy Rose Deal. And this journal was, I think, quite instrumental in fostering cross-linguistic work in semantics. And so one of the early articles we published there was by Lisa Mathieson on wide scope indefinite. It's a beautiful article. We also, say, published Benita Dayal's work on the scope marking construction in questions. It's like, what do you think who came to the meeting? That's how you could say it in German. That's how you could say it in Hindi. And in English, you would say, who did you say came to the meeting? And so that's the so-called scope marking construction. So Benita Dayal wrote a very famous paper in our journal on that topic. And so on. So that was something very, very important for us, was the investigation, cross-linguistic investigation of meaning, in particular in under-investigated languages. And so for that, you had to develop fieldwork techniques, standards for how to work with a language consultant who is not a trained linguist. And so that's very much like, the techniques are very much like experimental work, say, when you work with children and you want to assess a child's knowledge of language. And there's Lisa Matheson has been absolutely instrumental in developing the standards for that kind of work. So cross-linguistic work is really, it's very, very important. Together with Lisa Matheson, we also founded a conference. It's called SULA, and Semantics of Underrepresented Languages in the Americas. And that now has a sister conference where, because people felt, field workers felt that we also want to have a conference for Asian, African, and Austronesian languages. And so there is AAA, that is the sister conference of SULA. So in semantics, that has been quite a development towards cross-linguistic semantics, as it has in syntax, I understand.
Moving more specifically towards modality, how does that vary across languages, and how does that link with other cognitive systems?
That's another very, very interesting language. And so there's one question about variation. Again, there, Lisa Matheson has been quite instrumental. Also, Amy Rose Deal in so figuring out what are the parameters of variation in the area of modality. And so let me maybe start with the cognitive aspect. So what is modality? What are the cognitive abilities required? And so my favorite way of thinking about it is that it all starts that there is a part of reality, a part of actuality, like the room where you are or where I am. And what we are wondering is that, given this piece of the actual world, how could that piece continue beyond our own experience? What may the surroundings of that piece look like? What are the possibilities? So we have access to a limited piece of reality. What could the rest of that reality look like? And so that is the fundamental cognitive piece. And, you know, my cat, who's next door, can do that kind of reasoning. You know, a cat sees a can opener and can conclude from that what the possibilities for the future are. So there's a link from can opener to a can with cat food in it. And so this basic ability, we can assume, is a very general one that a lot of creatures, animals have. And now the question is, what do humans do with that ability, or how do they refine it, or what does it look like? How does it manifest itself? And so one thing that we do as humans is we categorize the possibilities. And so the piece of reality from which possibilities are projected have been called an anchor. So Valentin Akka has been quite instrumental in that way of thinking. So we have a real world anchor, piece of reality. And then we can, for example, when we talk about abilities, about your or my abilities, we can take that anchor, and that anchor may be a temporal stage of a person at a time. And then the possibilities projected from that, we can think about the futures. What are possible futures for that stage of an individual? That's one type of ability. If depending on who the anchor and what the anchor is, this could be modality linked to abilities of a person. But also, I mean, we can do this with immaterial objects. We can think about the futures of my desk here. What can I do with that desk? I can use it as firewood, for example. That's a possible future for that desk. Maybe somebody could transform it into a kitchen table. That's another future of my desk. So that's one type of ability. So we can classify it according to the anchor, and then we are forward looking from the anchor. Another way of constructing modality would be to look backwards from the anchor. Say, given that stretch of actuality that we have now, what may possible pasts look like? And so this is a type of modality that I think animals can't do. But this is the modality of a historian. A historian sees a relic in the world, and then she starts reasoning of what is a possible past, given that we have this piece in the reality. And that is what we sometimes call epistemic modality. So this is a type of modality. So here we get types of modalities, and that is something that you can see then in the way modals are lexicalized in the languages of the world. So we have epistemic modality has particular properties. We have this ability type of forward, future-oriented modality. That's a particular type. So that's one thing we do with modals. We classify them according to what is the anchor, what kind of properties does the anchor have, the real world piece. And then we classify them, is it forward looking, is it backward looking, or sidewards looking? And so these are types of modalities. And then we can qualify over modalities. We can say things there is a possibility, or every possibility leads to a particular result. Then we can rank possibilities. And so that gets us to concepts like probability or likelihood, desirability, things like that. And so these are in a way the cognitive parameters for modality. And now we can sort of look, what do languages do with them? What kind of distinctions do they make? How do they classify anchors? How do they do the ranking? How do they do the qualification? And so that's sort of one way of thinking about modality that brings in a psychological aspect, but also brings in the cross-linguistic aspect. So that's just in a nutshell way to think. Then of course we have ways to restrict modalities, like with if clauses or relative clauses, we can sort of cut them down. Yeah.
So you mentioned these sort of pieces of reality. Is that something like a situation then?
That could be, yeah, it could be a situation, it could be an individual, it could be a temporal stage of an individual at a time. Yeah, any part, if you take the actual world, some concrete particular, take the whole world, and any part of it could be an anchor. Of course, I mean, as human beings, we don't take very gerrymandered bits. We take like cohesive bits of reality usually.
Just about situations, how do situation semantics and event semantics differ, and how if at all, do you think they can play nicely together?
Yeah. Also, another excellent question. I think events are just particular types of situations. The situation, the way I'm thinking of it, it's just a part of a world, a part of a possible world. So there's the actual world, and then there are possible worlds, just like the actual world, but not actual. And then any part of it would be a situation. And then we usually, I mean, the way we individuate situations is we like to think of them that they are temporally and spatially connected, usually they have some connectedness properties to them. And events are not, in a way, they're not entities that are in any way different. It's just like events play a role in the argument structure of verbs. So when we have, say, adverbs like walk slowly, or swim quickly, or work carefully, then we're predicating something of a part of the world. And this part of the world is characterized in some sense by the verb. So we have a swim. So a swim is a particular part of a world that has particular properties. Namely, it has, some consists in a stage of an individual being engaged in a particular activity or something like that. And so the way I'm thinking of it is like event and situations. I mean, they're not different types of entities. Events are particular types of situations. And they are in a way individuated, or they're carved out. They're individuated, say, by verbs or by adjectives. So they're just characterized by verbs in a particular way. So they're situations that have particular properties. And so like a swim, what is a swim? So a swim is so it's a part of a world that contains, in a way, nothing but a person engaged in a particular activity at a particular time.
So is it something like the smallest possible situation? Or?
Yeah, so there's some smallness involved there. So that in my swim, for example, you're not present in my swim. My desk is not, or even the swimming pool where I'm in is not present in my swim. So it is just a stage of me and this activity that is my movements as they're evolve over time. These are part of it. So there's some minimality certainly involved, but what that minimality is given by the description that we use to pick out the event, like swimming. A swimming event contains swimming and nothing else.
So moving again a little bit broader, how when we're doing this sort of semantics, are these is this meant to be semantics of a public language? And how does this link with notions of I language and mental representation generally?
What is happening?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, now you're back. So I didn't hear you. Yeah.
So are these are we doing semantics of a public language, and how does this link with notions of I language, individualist, or and are these situations and things meant to be mentally represented? There's probably a lot there.
Yeah, it's a lot. So let's just maybe talk to each other to sort of make clear that we really understand each other. What's a public language? Maybe we have to think a little bit about what's a public language. So it is certainly, I mean, it's something we share. So when we talk with each other, we understand each other. And so that means we share something. But then, of course, we each have some representation of one or more languages in our brains. And so is your question, what kind of a theory are we making? Is it a theory of just my private language? What even is my private language?
Yeah.
I mean, even when I'm sort of thinking, I'm thinking in English or I'm thinking in German, depending on what I'm doing. And certainly some private aspects in it, maybe some feel completely idiosyncratic to me, but aren't we sort of trying, to understand each other? And so trying to understand each other, what we utter and what we assume that, say, and what I assume that that I know, etc. Yeah. So our common knowledge, we're sort of aiming for common knowledge. So we're aiming for a common language. Yeah. So that's what a child acquiring a language is acquiring, a common language, like what her community shares in the way of linguistic knowledge. And so in that sense, the theories that we're making are theories about public language. But of course, we are also interested in how this language, how is it represented in the brain? So we're interested in that too. But there again, we're not really interested in quirks of individual people in the brain. There again, just like when we investigate the heart, everybody has very specific properties of their heart. But when people talk about the human heart, they assume that there are enough commonalities so that we can make a theory of how the heart functions and what a ill heart is. And so I'm sort of thinking in those terms, just having attended this medicine defense this morning. They talk about very generally about how the nervous system functions, how the heart functions. In particular, in this case, it was about the heart, the connections between heartbeat and information uptake. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, these medical people, they talk about the heart as a general human property, and I think in the very same sense, we talk about language as a general human property, even though we of course know very well that this property is instantiated in individual ways in every human, and is not the same in every human, but there's enough sameness so that we can make general statements about it, I suppose. Yeah.
So the relevant semantic rules and things are still represented by individual mind brains and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then, of course, you make the right distinctions. We're also more and more interested in, say, variation in dialects and in non-standard varieties of languages. And so once you're sort of interested in these questions, of course, you have a subcategory that you generalize over, so you make general statements about African-American English, and, varieties like that. Yeah. But that's again like the heart, I suppose. The people have, not everybody has the same heart.
Yeah. So you've described the characterization of the conditional as a two-place relation as a syntactic mistake. How should we approach natural language conditionals? What was wrong with that approach?
I see. So you're well prepared. You didn't tell me that I should prepare. Okay. So let me maybe go there. Yeah, so the when you take a logic class, you have something like an arrow, a conditional operator that links two propositions. And that's what I pronounced was a mistake. And the idea was that generally there isn't an operator, a binary operator corresponding to these two pieces, if and then. So, I mean, that's what the arrow corresponds to. There's something like a discontinuous operator, if then. And so what I proposed was that we should think of the if clause all by itself as a device that restricts an operator. And then the question is, of course, what are these operators that are being restricted? And the other proposal was to maybe not start out by looking at bare indicative conditionals. On my view, these types of conditionals, like, if the sun is shining, the soil is dry, or something like that. This would be a bare indicative conditional. So these have been the standard conditionals. These are, I think, to the present day, the conditionals most philosophers are obsessing about. And so my proposal would be, don't start out by looking at those conditionals. Look at conditionals where there is an overt operator. And for example, probability conditionals of this kind, famously. Yeah, so if Meg coughs, she's probably ill, something like that. So we have a probability conditional. And they are particularly interesting because it has been shown that there is, in a way, if you're assuming by a two-valued logic, then you can't find a two-valued, you can't find an operator that would give you the right result if a probability operator just had scope over that conditional. Okay, so that was a very, very important result by David Lewis. And in a way that got me going, said, let's just, rather than starting out with these bare conditionals, let's look very systematically at all cases where if clauses overtly restrict an operator. So that could be a probability operator, that could be a necessity operator, that could be an adverbial operator like always or probably or sometimes or whatever. And first sort of try to construct a semantics for those. And then the bare conditionals, in a way, they would be the limiting case. There would be just the one case where there just happens not to be an operator. And there you can posit one. And you can posit one that is, say, a necessity operator that is so limited that its only domain of discourse is the actual world. That would give you then the material conditional as a limiting case. So that was that was the reasoning behind it. It was, okay, there are conditionals where that can't possibly be interpreted as material implications. Let's take those as a general case, and the bare conditionals, let them be the limiting case where just we have a trivial operator. So that was the reasoning, and yeah, it's a nice idea.
You've also provided an influential analysis of causatives. So what's now, I suppose, little v, but what is that, and what other sorts of verbs do you think the like verb explains? What else can take that position?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another interesting question. For that one, I would have had to prepare a little. That has been a long time that I've worked on causatives, and I mean the ones actually I think, if I remember correctly, I only worked on one type of causatives, and these are resultative constructions. Like I painted the barn red, so or I drank. I drank the teapot dry, I think you say in English. In German, you would say I drank the teapot empty, which is a little bit more transparent. So it's just one type of causative constructions that I look at among the many causative constructions that you find in natural language. And the question with those is that this causative relation seems to be a particular tight relation. So it is not just if I drink the teapot dry, it just doesn't really mean the same as there was a drinking action, and that action caused the teapot to be dry or empty. So that would cover more examples, because you could have, like, by drinking something, you could set in motion a machine that sucks water out of the teapot or something. So when we say I drank the teapot dry, there's always a particular tight, narrow causal relation. And that is the challenge for the linguistic analysis, to characterize, to have a notion of causality that somehow excludes these long causal chains. And so you have to, in some way, you have to find a way of characterizing this tight relation in a cognitively plausible way. And so that's what I was trying to do. I don't quite know, looking backwards, whether it was entirely successful, but I think the proposal was that I said, well, we have a drinking event, and then we have an event of the teapot becoming dry. And in those causative constructions, we literally identify those two events. That is, we stretch the drinking event a little bit in including these events affecting the teapot. As I said, I'm not sure. I haven't gone back to that work in a long time. I don't know what I think about it, whether it was successful or not. So I'm less invested in that particular proposal, say that in the conditional proposal. I can see that people could come up with other ideas of how to characterize this particular tight relationship. And so I would be interested to see if any of you, so this is a topic that seems to interest you. So I could see that there's a lot of work still to be done, in particular maybe to have a typology of these causal relations that are realized in natural languages. So there's this particular tight one that you find across languages, but then what other types of causal relations do languages express? And I'm not sure whether there's really too much formal semantic work there. So go for it if you.
Is that what the little V head is meant to be doing, sort of providing a typology of verbs, as well as selecting external arguments, but the head itself.
Yeah, that's also, it's a really interesting question. I never finished this work on voice. That was, I planned this to be a book, but then I was busy. I get into other interests that interest me more. Teaching was quite demanding, And so I never finished that work. So what I really aimed for, what I wanted to do was to develop a theory of voice alternations. And so the little v was there to introduce the external argument. And so it all started out that I identified a particular type of adjectival passives where I think I could show that the external argument is literally not there. And so they, what, yeah, yeah, that's how it started out. And these were sort of German adjectival passives. And in English, you can't really distinguish the stative adjectival passives from the verbal adjectival passives. But in German, you can. And so in German, there are these stative adjectival, purely, very clearly stative adjectival passives that do not presuppose an action by anyone.
So what sort of example, if I can ask?
Yeah, so let me see whether I can remember the example. I mean, you would have, I mean, even in English, I think you have something like the road is obstructed or something like that.
Okay, yeah.
Or an obstructed artery or something like that. So you could be born with it. They may never have been a process of obstruction. Whereas in, say, in verbal passives, I mean, there's always the implication, like in verbal passives of agentive verbs, there's always the implication that there was an agent. Whereas with these adjectival, with these stative applications, there isn't necessarily an implication that there ever was an agent or anything like that. And so I use that as an argument to say that the verbs are born without an external argument. They're born, and so if they're born without an external argument, so that means that there has to be a process adding the external argument. And so now the question is, how is the external argument added? So in the simple cases, say we have agentive verbs, and that means the verb, the event argument of the verb is an action argument. So it has the property of being an action. And so once a verb describes actions, this verb can have an agent argument. So what we can do is we can let the event argument do the work of selecting the type of external argument it wants. And so, okay, so that works with action verbs. It works with certain stative verbs because the eventuality argument is not an action argument, so no agent can be added, so it has to be something else. But then there are, of course, all these experiencer verbs, and that's where the story gets interesting. Now you'll have experiencer verbs. I mean, they are maybe external arguments that are not classifiable in any of those ways. And so, so this is a missing piece in this work. But I was also interested then in what happens in a verbal passive. And I was interested also very much in, say, middle constructions, as you find in Dravidian languages and also in, say, ancient Greek. And so that's where that work was going, but was never finished. Again, so you can finish it. To just, I mean, it's sort of the idea to sort of see what does the verb root do, and then develop a theory of voice alternations out of that. And again, for this to be interesting, it should be cross-linguistic. And so you would look at a lot of languages with with voice alternation. So I looked at Tamil there, and so I was very interested in that. And but yeah, so I have a manuscript. I have pages written, but I never finished it. So that's just the way it is.
Almost getting to the end, but do you have any thoughts about the sort of criticisms of truth conditional and referential semantics that people like Noam Chomsky and Paul Piotrowski have come up with recently?
So what was the second name you mentioned?
Paul Piotrowski.
Oh, Paul Piotrowski. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So from that corner, yeah. So that happened from the very beginning. There has been a lot of criticism of truth conditional semantics, maybe sort of early on by Davidson, and also like in Oxford. I mean, that was sort of the line, I think, originally that took hold in Oxford. And so I've been reading up quite a bit recently on the early history of semantics. And I could see that there were developments like intentional semantics in particular, starting with Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, but also Alonzo Church, so the inventor of the lambda calculus. And so they were all very interested in formal semantics and had the tools for formal compositional semantics. So there were already intentional semantics that was already all in place. And what happened then, but what these people yet did not know how to do was the connection with syntax. And so they became very interested then, at least some people, let's say not Church and not Carnap, but philosophers at that point became very interested in Chomsky's work, because what they hoped was that he would help with connecting semantics and syntax, because Chomsky at the time, I mean, he very clearly had the idea that maybe a semantic component could be grafted on a syntactic structure that was a little bit more abstract than surface structure. And so that was something that philosophers were very excited about. And these philosophers included Davidson. And also Chomsky was then invited to Oxford to give the John Locke lectures. So people were really excited, even though, and so that gets to your question, not everybody would go along with, say, the Church-Frege program of a referential semantics. And so Davidson in particular did not. So Davidson went for truth conditional semantics. He was very much taken with Chomsky's syntactic theory, but rejected referential semantics, meaning he would reject the idea that, say, every type of expression has some kind of denotation. And I think that also still gets us a little bit into the current divide about truth conditional semantics. So there are the people like me who I'm basically, I mean, that was early on, David Lewis was maybe the person that was most important for me getting into formal semantics, who very clearly sort of took on a referential semantics over possible worlds in the tradition of Carnap, in the tradition, basically Carnap, with the formalities, with the formal apparatus that Church gave us. And then there was, on the other hand, there was like Davidson, there was the Oxford crowd. And I think that's more like where Piotrowski and maybe Larson, Siegel, where they are coming from. So where do I stand? In some sense, well, there was, of course, I mean, there was at the time, there was Katz and Fodor, who were most closely allied with Chomsky. They had their own idea about what meanings are, and those ideas, I think, have not survived. As I said, I found David Lewis most interesting, and the reason is that he, in some sense, he he was very taken with Chomsky. He took the idea from Katz and Postel and Fodor of a compositional semantics, of how to pair syntactic rules with semantic interpretations. But of course, he opposed very strongly the mentalistic ideas that Katz and Fodor had about meanings. So this is, in some sense, this is how the field divides up. So there are bits and pieces from everywhere. So there's the Chomskyan idea of a recursive syntactic component. There's the idea then of having semantic rules that follow syntactic rules. Actually, David Luce went one step further and said, well, if the base component was a categorical grammar, then we wouldn't even need any semantic projection rules. We could just have functional application as the general projection rule. Of course, that does require referential semantics. It does require that qualifier phrases and connectives, they all have denotations that have a kind of reference. Yeah, and then there are the people like Davidson who rejected, the idea that there is reference involved for all meaningful expressions, and so you have these syntactic rules that then compute truth conditions, but without the referential semantics. And I've always worked with the referential semantics, but I don't know. For me, it's not a big thing. When I look at, say, books like Larson and Siegel, and there's actually a new textbook by Larson coming out, which avoids a referential semantics, and so would be more in line with Petrovsky. I just see that what I'm interested in really is the empirical content of those rules, and they're kind of translatable. I mean, it is really a philosophical objection in the end that I frankly don't care so much about, and so maybe that is the short answer. So whether, I'm not, I'm not bothered by thinking that a qualifier phrase has a reference, has a denotation. That isn't bothered. And maybe if you say, as Davidson did, we want to make clear what kind of contribution that qualifier phrase makes to the truth conditions of a sentence, then I would say, well, my referential semantics maybe could be understood in this way. It says, take a predicate picks out some individuals, and then we're saying something. Does this predicate apply to every individual or just some or most? And we can state this generalization by giving the qualifier phrase a denotation, or we can avoid to give that qualifier phrase a denotation by stating a rule that basically has the same effect. So that's in a way, for me, not being a philosopher, I'm not very much bothered by by the difference. Yeah.
The issues of what the nature of the logical form is the same.
Oh, logical form. No, that I'm interested. Like
that's sort of agreed upon, whether you think it's fully specified truth conditions or not. Is that?
Yeah, but that of course is also controversial. Whether there is anything like a syntactic level of logical form, or whether we have direct interpretation, as like Polly Jacobson would advocate, which is then yields to an extreme version of a referential semantics, which would even go further than, say, I would ever go. And so that is just sort of another interesting controversy in the field. Yeah.
So about the cross-linguistic data, do you think there's anything to the assumption then that LF English and Japanese are identical?
Actually, identical. I don't know. I mean, it probably. I mean, if there's anything identical, probably it wouldn't be something that is spelled LF with capitals or something. So there's a difference. I mean, when philosophers talk about logical form, then they spell it with not with capitals. And when Chomsky talks about logical form, then he spells it with capitals. And then these are two different things. And I don't know. I don't think I have personally any evidence one way or other. What I mean, if we say assume something like logical form with capitals, whether that would mean that they are all the same, I would rather say no, because I mean that would be what you would have to think about is if so LF with capitals is a level of syntactic representation that is in a very systematic way connected to surface structures. And so we do know that the surface structures are very different in natural languages. So the surface structure will be different. And so if there's a common LF, you would have a good theory with good generalizations that would yield the surface structures from a unique underlying structure. And I think you would probably do what generative semantics did at the time. I think that was the idea. So they had these like Macaulay and Lakoff. I don't know whether you even know. You're too young for
I've heard the name in hushed whispers.
Yeah. So that was what this huge, like the linguistic wars were about.
Yeah.
And, so I mean, they really had underlying representations, deep structure representations that looked a little bit like predicate calculus representations in an idiosyncratic way. And so if those kinds of structures are present for every language, so that means you now would have to discover the mechanisms that translate those into the various surface realizations. And I think this project has not succeeded. I mean, you would have like beautiful laws or generalizations, just like in phonology, maybe, where you have an underlying representation, and then you have very general, interesting laws that give you the surface realizations. And I think that probably was the idea of the generative semanticists. And it's a good idea, but I think unlike in phonology, those general laws have not been discovered. And so I would say it's a failed project. So that would be my guess. Yeah.
And finally, going back to something we talked a little bit about, but how much do you think semantics has changed since you started working in it? And what do you think the biggest insights since then have been that weren't around when you were a student?
Yeah, so cross-linguistic semantics is a big thing. So that certainly was not around in any interesting way. So that is one thing. Then the multi-dimensions of meanings is another thing. So we started talking about this, thinking about the representation of meanings as a musical score that has different voices. So there's a truth conditional tier. Then there is, like, if you do information structure, say focus semantics, there is another tier that generates alternatives. And so that is a big new field of investigation. Started out with focus semantics and then has developed now further, like all kinds of scalar expressions, implicatures, etc. And so these approaches, I mean, assume that there are several dimensions, like voices in the score. Then also, I mean, these expressionists' meanings, conventional implicatures, more emotional type of meanings. So I think that is certainly completely different. So that did not exist. So multi-dimensional, multi-dimensions of meaning. That is certainly something that is new that I can think of. I also, I mean, I'm now sort of closely working with Jonathan Phillips, who is a cognitive scientist. So that was not something I was capable of when I was younger. I had actually my first job outside of Constance, where I grew up academically. I had it at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, and I was fired. I could not, I mean, at the time, I really wanted to be a semanticist, and that was new to me. That was hard fought to even get into this field. With a lot of investment to just get the education I wanted. And so the research done there, I could not make a connection. So now, if you hired me there again, I would know how to make the connection. So that is something that certainly has changed. I would know how to connect what I am doing and what I'm interested in into a cognitive science research project that works then with experimental methods. So I could do that much better.
All right. I think that's all our questions. Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Well, actually, I want to thank you because this was a wonderful interview. I think you really prepared for this interview. And if I had known, as I said, I would have prepared myself.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I hope you found it interesting.
I found it really interesting. The questions were wonderful questions, and you just obviously thought a lot about the questions that you asked. And so, yeah, thank you. And all the best. I'm supposed to be in Oxford next spring, but giving the John Locke lectures.
Oh,
but I think it's stuck. I mean, the person who was scheduled to give the John Locke lectures last year hasn't given them yet.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, like Susan Wolfman, she's giving them. I mean, I'm currently scheduled for next spring, but they haven't rescheduled. It could be a year later or something like that. So I will be there.
Okay.
Looking forward. Yeah.
Thanks again.